An 84-year-old woman vanished from her own home in the middle of the night. No forced entry, no ransom call, no proof of life. Just a pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning and a doorbell camera that had already been disabled nearly an hour before. Whoever walked into Nancy Guthrie's life that night in Tucson, Arizona, did not stumble upon an opportunity. They came prepared. They came with knowledge. And somewhere in the gap between what law enforcement has told the public and what the documented evidence actually shows, the truth is still waiting to be found. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie, a mother, a grandmother, a woman whose disappearance set off one of the most closely watched missing persons investigations in recent American memory, not only because of who she is, but because of who raised her daughter. Because Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized faces in American television journalism. And that fact, while never the center of the investigation, cast a long and unavoidable light on everything that followed. But this is not a story about fame. It is a story about a locked house, a disabled security system, and a question that a veteran journalist asked on day 3 of the investigation. A question that official statements have never fully answered. Let us begin at the last confirmed moment anyone can place Nancy Guthrie in the living world. Saturday evening, January 31st, 2026. Nancy had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso Cain. By most accounts, it was an unremarkable evening. Family gathering, the kind of ordinary night that none of us think to memorize until it becomes the last one. When the evening ended, Tommaso drove Nancy home. He walked her to the door and waited. The garage closed behind her at approximately 9:50 in the evening. That was the last verifiable moment. By 11 o'clock the following morning, she was gone. In any missing persons investigation, there's a principle that experienced detectives return to before almost anything else. The last person confirmed to have seen the victim alive is the first person who must be cleared. Not because proximity equals guilt. It rarely does. But because establishing what happened in the hours after that final contact is the only way to understand the shape of what came next. For Nancy Guthrie, the critical window runs from 1:47 in the morning, when her doorbell camera was disabled, to 2:28 a.m., when her pacemaker disconnected from her phone. 41 minutes. A motion sensor inside the property activated at 2:12. Within those 41 minutes, something was done to a woman in her own home that she did not do to herself. Where was Tommaso Cain during those 41 minutes? That question has not been publicly answered. The Pima County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, issued a statement on February 16th clearing the family, all siblings and spouses, as possible suspects. It was a direct statement, unambiguous in its language. But it offered no methodology. It cited no alibi. It referenced no corroborating surveillance footage, no phone records, no witness who could account for Cain's location during the window when investigators believed Nancy was taken. The clearance was issued. The explanation was not. And then there is the car. Think about what a forensic hold on a vehicle actually means. When investigators impound and process a car after a crime, they're not simply checking a box. They are looking for trace evidence, fibers, fingerprints, biological material, microscopic fragments of the crime scene itself. A car that has been taken into evidence is a car that investigators believe may tell them something they do not yet know. On February 16th, the same day the sheriff issued his public clearance of the Guthrie family, the vehicle Tommaso Cain had used to drive Nancy home was sitting in a forensic evidence lot. It was still there 10 days later. When reporters asked the Pima County Sheriff's Department directly, the answer was careful and precise. The vehicle, they said, remains part of the investigation. Part of the investigation, not part of a routine closing process. Not being held for procedural paperwork. Part of an active investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman, a full 10 days after the family who owned it had been publicly cleared. There are innocent explanations. Forensic processing takes time regardless of what it ultimately reveals. Investigators may be holding the car or not, because they believe Cayenne was involved, but because they believe the real perpetrator may have touched it, observed it, or used information about it in ways they are still working to understand. If the true suspect was watching the house on the night of January 31st, they would have seen Nancy arrive home in that car. They would have known which vehicle it was. They would have known she was dropped off, that the driver left, and that she was now inside alone. That possibility raises its own question. Who would have known that Nancy was being dropped off at 9:50 that night? Who would have known her schedule, her location, her routine well enough to position themselves to act in the specific window between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning? The crime was not opportunistic. The camera placement, the timing, the apparent knowledge of the interior layout. This was executed by someone with information. The question investigators are presumably working to answer is how that information was obtained. Ask yourself this. When you hear that the cameras were systematically disabled, not one, but multiple cameras across multiple locations, what does that tell you about the nature of this crime? Random intruders do not conduct reconnaissance on elderly women in quiet neighborhoods. They do not map security systems. They do not identify and selectively disable multiple cameras in the dark hours of a February morning. The person who entered Nancy Guthrie's home knew where to look. Ashleigh Banfield, a journalist with 36 years of experience at CNN, HLN, and Court TV, cited a senior law enforcement source who told her that multiple cameras were compromised, not just the front entrance nest camera, but additional locations. The knowledge required to disable a multi-point security system suggests one of a small number of possibilities. The suspect had been inside the home before. The suspect had conducted extensive external surveillance of the property, or the suspect had received information about the layout from someone already familiar with it. Tommaso Cayenne had been to Nancy's home many times. He was married to her daughter. He was someone who would have walked past those cameras dozens of times without a second thought, the way any family member does, noticing without noticing, absorbing detail without intent. That does not make him responsible for what happened, but it places him factually in the category of people who would have possessed that kind of passive, accumulated knowledge about the property. On February 3rd, 2026, Banfield went public with what her source had told her. The source described as impeccable, known for years, someone with direct access to the investigation and its evidence, told her that investigators were treating Tommaso Cayenne as a possible prime suspect. She was careful with language. She used the word may. But the name was spoken, the claim was on record, and the law enforcement source who provided it had not been corrected, contradicted, or walked back by anyone with authority over the investigation. The next day, the Pima County Sheriff's Department told TMZ they had not identified a suspect or person of interest. They declined to confirm the car had been seized. The denial was clean. 3 days after that, investigators arrived at the home Tommaso Cayenne shares with Annie Guthrie. It was a consensual search, no warrant required because the couple invited them in. Deputies spent nearly 3 hours inside. A former CIA officer and FBI special agent, Tracy Walder, reviewed footage and told People magazine that the equipment carried out by investigators was consistent with standard forensic evidence collection tools. White cases, brown bags, the visible language of a crime scene response, not a courtesy visit. On February 10th, the Sheriff's Department posted publicly that investigative activity at the Guthrie residences would continue through that night and into the following day. 6 days after that public statement about continued investigative activity, the sheriff cleared the family. What changed in those 6 days? What did investigators find or not find during the 3-hour search? What forensic conclusions shifted the calculus from the car is still in evidence, and investigative activity continues till the family has been cleared. Those answers have not been made public. That gap is not a conspiracy. It is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is simply an unanswered question sitting at the center of a public record that has been examined by journalists, investigators, and ordinary people trying to make sense of what happened to an elderly woman in the middle of the night. if you find this kind of methodical, evidence-based analysis worth following. This case is still developing. The answers, when they come, will matter. Now consider what the FBI released on February 12th. Based on analysis of the doorbell camera footage, the camera that captured the suspect before it was disabled, investigators describe a male figure, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build, wearing a mask and gloves, and carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. It is a description that could fit a significant portion of the adult male population. The range of height does not definitively eliminate anyone without additional specific information. Law enforcement has not publicly stated whether Tommaso Cayen's physical profile places him outside that range or within it. They cleared him. They did not explain the physical comparison. The DNA evidence deserves careful examination because this is the point where many observers believe the case is settled. The reality is more complicated than it appears. Investigators recovered DNA from an unknown male at Nancy's residence. That same unknown male's DNA was also found on a glove, discovered approximately 2 miles from the home. The sample was run through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, which contains profiles from convicted felons, individuals arrested in certain jurisdictions, and other specific populations. There was no match. Sheriff Nanos stated that the DNA did not match anyone in the Guthrie family. Here is what that statement does and does not tell us. CODIS contains the DNA of people who have been arrested or convicted of crimes. It does not contain the DNA of the general public. Tommaso Cayen has no criminal record, no arrests, no convictions. His DNA would not be in CODIS. When the sheriff says the unknown DNA did not match the Guthrie family, the critical question is whether that determination was made because investigators directly collected a biological sample from Cayen, compared it to the crime scene sample, and achieved a definitive biological exclusion, or whether the unknown DNA was run through a database that simply does not contain his profile and therefore produced no match. Those are two entirely different things. One is science. The other is the absence of information. Law enforcement has not publicly clarified which process occurred. Forensic genetic genealogy is underway, a technique that can identify individuals through extended family connections and ancestry databases even when a direct match does not exist. Results from that process can take days, weeks, or months. When those results arrive, they will either point to someone or they will not. If they did not point to Tommaso Cayen, the case against the idea of his involvement will be considerably stronger. If investigators directly tested his DNA and excluded him biologically, that is powerful exculpatory evidence. But the public does not know whether that test was performed. On February 16th, when Sheriff Nanos cleared the Guthrie family, Ashleigh Banfield did not retract her reporting. Her source, the senior law enforcement official with direct knowledge of the investigation and access to evidence the public has not seen, did not recant. Banfield stated on record that her source maintained the original assessment. Even after watching the sheriff publicly declare the family cleared, the source who had called Cayen a possible prime suspect continued to hold that position. Sources can be wrong. They can have incomplete information. They can misread investigative activity or draw conclusions that the full evidentiary picture does not support. That is entirely possible, but this was not a casual tip from a peripheral figure. Banfield described someone at the senior level of law enforcement with direct access to forensic results, witness statements, surveillance analysis, and evidence being processed. Someone who, even after a public clearance by the lead agency, was not prepared to say they had been mistaken. Why? What could that source have seen? What piece of evidence, what timeline discrepancy, what forensic detail that sustained that assessment through the public clearance and beyond? We do not know, and that not knowing is precisely what makes this case so difficult to close in the public mind, even as it remains officially open. Let us be clear about what the documented record shows and what it does not show. Tommaso Cyan was the last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. His publicly verifiable alibi for the 41-minute window during which investigators believe she was taken has not been disclosed. The vehicle he used that evening remained in a forensic evidence lot 10 days after his public clearance. Investigators conducted a 3-hour, consensual, evidence-producing search of his home after a journalist named him, then announced continued investigative activity, then cleared the family 6 days later. The person who took Nancy disabled multiple cameras, suggesting familiarity with the property layout, a familiarity that Cyan, as a regular family visitor, would logically possess. The FBI's physical description is broad enough that it does not eliminate him without additional specifics. The DNA evidence may or may not have directly excluded him, and law enforcement has not clarified which. A senior investigative source with access to case materials maintained, even after the clearance, that Cyan remained a possible prime suspect. Those are not accusations. They're documented details drawn from the public record. The sheriff's statements, Banfield's reporting, the FBI's physical description, the public acknowledgement of the forensic vehicle hold. None of them have been explained away. None of the questions they raise have been publicly answered. There is another side to this, and it demands the same honest consideration. Tommaso Cyan and Annie Guthrie cooperated throughout this investigation. They consented to searches of their home without requiring a warrant. They made themselves available. The family is offering a reward of $1 million in cash, anonymous tips accepted, for any information leading to Nancy's recovery. These are not the actions of people who have something to hide. These are the actions of a family in agony, doing everything they can to bring someone home. If investigators directly tested Tommaso's DNA and definitively excluded him, that biological evidence would be among the most powerful exculpatory facts imaginable. If his alibi was verified through means that simply were not publicized, phone records, surveillance from another location, a credible witness, then the clearance is exactly what it appears to be, a thorough investigative conclusion. The sheriff called the online speculation against the family cruel. If Tommaso Cyan had no involvement in what happened to Nancy, what he has endured in the court of public opinion is something no innocent person should ever have to face. Both things can be true simultaneously. A family can be innocent, and the questions arising from the documented record can still demand answers. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 29 days. She is 84 years old. She left her home without her medication, without warning, without any sign of voluntary departure. The masked figure captured briefly on her doorbell camera before it was disabled remains unidentified. The DNA recovered at her home and on a glove found 2 miles away has not matched anyone in the national database. Forensic genetic genealogy continues. The car sits in an evidence lot. The investigation remains open. Savannah Guthrie, speaking publicly last Friday, acknowledged what no daughter should have to contemplate. She spoke of her mother possibly being in heaven now, with her own parents, with her brother Pierce, with the people she loved who came before her. And then, through that grief, she turned to the public. If you know something, please come forward. $1 million. Cash. Help us bring her home. There's a particular kind of anguish in not knowing where to grieve, in holding open the door of hope because you have not yet been given permission to close it. Savannah Guthrie is living in that space. Her family is living in that space. And somewhere in Tucson, Arizona, there's a person, or there are people, who know exactly what happened in those 41 minutes between the disabled camera and the silence pacemaker. Someone knew the layout of that house. Someone knew the camera locations. Someone knew which car Nancy came home in and at what time. Someone knew the window, the precise, specific window, when she would be alone and vulnerable, when the cameras were dark and the neighborhood was quiet and no one would come. That level of knowledge does not fall from the sky. It comes from somewhere. It comes from someone. The official investigation will continue. DNA results will eventually arrive. one way or another. Alibi documentation, if it exists, may eventually become part of the public record. The forensic processing of the vehicle will conclude. At some point, the gap between what law enforcement has said and what the evidence shows will either close or widen into something that can no longer be contained in careful statements. If Tommaso Caian had nothing to do with this, the truth will establish that completely. His alibi will be verifiable. His DNA will be excluded through direct comparison. The forensic evidence will point away from him and toward whoever actually took Nancy from her home. And when that happens, every question raised here will have its answer. If the evidence eventually points in a different direction, if the forensic genetic genealogy produces a name, if the process car yields something unexpected, if the senior law enforcement source's sustained assessment turns out to reflect something real, then these 7 details sitting quietly in the public record will have been a roadmap that was available from nearly the beginning. Either way, the truth is out there. And somewhere tonight, a door in Tucson is still waiting to explain what passed through it. What do you believe happened in those 41 minutes? And what piece of this record do you think still holds the answer?